Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join Volterra's webinar, sponsored by our friends at ACT News. I'm your host and moderator, Virginia Hewitt, and today's topic is the building blocks of fleet electrification, from pilot projects to full-scale operations. This webinar will provide some actionable insights to help you avoid common pitfalls we've experienced during the transition. I have some great panelists for you today, and we're all very much looking forward to the discussion. So here we have today's agenda. I'm going to start with some housekeeping items, and then we'll move on to our panel discussion. We've put together a fun format for you today. We'll be introducing some classic mistakes and hidden pitfalls we at Volterra have helped our customers through. For each of these, we've got tips, tricks, and real-life stories for how to overcome each. Towards the end, we've made plenty of time for Q&A. Okay, on to the housekeeping items. I do ask that you please stay muted to minimize background noise, but feel free to use the chat. As questions or comments come up during the webinar, just type them into the chat box and we'll get to you during the Q&A session. Very many of you submitted questions ahead of time, and we hope to get through those. You can also use the raise hand feature to ask questions live during Q&A. And finally, I do need to mention that this webinar is being recorded. The recording and any related materials will be shared with attendees afterwards. All right, next slide, please. I'm very excited to introduce you to our speakers today, some of the sharpest minds in fleet electrification and electric supply chain I've ever had the pleasure of working with. But just quickly, a few words about myself. My name is Virginia Hewitt, and I'm the Director of Business Development here at Volterra. I've been in the EV charging industry for about 6 years. Prior to this role, I was with Greenlots Shell Recharge Solutions. At Volterra, my focus is on the medium and heavy-duty vehicle classes, although I have seen it all. I have my bachelor's from Duke and my MBA from UNC at Chapel Hill. That's just to say I look great in every shade of blue. Today, you'll be hearing from Jeff Gunn. He's a registered professional engineer and our Director of Project Engineering. Jeff has over 15 years of experience designing for energy efficiency, resilience, and sustainability in the built environment. Jeff's been responsible for the planning and design of many fleet electrification projects and has successfully integrated solar PV, battery energy storage, and microgrids. We're so lucky to have Jeff as our Director of Project Engineering here at Volterra, where he leads a team developing site-specific designs that balance high-powered charging, utility interconnections, and overall project costs. Welcome, Jeff. Next, you'll be learning from Kaleo Quaresma, our Senior Director of Site Operations. Kaleo has been building, operating, and maintaining fueling and charging stations for fleets and the public for over 18 years. He's managed strategic operations and maintenance for fleets like Hertz, Lyft, the US Department of Energy, and many more. Now at Volterra, Kaleo oversees all of our charging, facility, and workplace operations. Welcome, Kaleo. Finally, it is my immense honor to introduce Marie Robinson, one of Volterra's board members. Marie brings over 30 years of leadership in supply chain transformation and sustainability. As Executive Vice President and Chief Supply Chain Officer at Cisco, she managed one of the largest private fleets in the US and led their efforts to electrify 35% of the fleet by 2030. A US Army veteran and a Bronze Star recipient, Marie now serves on several corporate boards and helps Volterra drive the transition to zero-emission transportation. Welcome, Marie. All right, now on to the good stuff. Next slide, please. The first mistake we want to highlight is in regards to, well, the whole thing, the effort it takes to electrify a fleet and develop a charging strategy. So Marie, can you please say a few words about a best practice of starting small?
Yeah, Virginia, thank you. And this is the right place to start, right? And I think that in these very early stages of electrification, all of the attention is going to get drawn to the vehicle, right? Everybody wants to touch the vehicles. They're sexy, they're fun. You want to understand what they're going to do. And those pilots are super important because you do have to test those vehicles and make sure that the routes you assume they're going to be right for are correct, that they perform in the various terrains and various climates in which they're going to need to perform. However, my tip is that while you're doing that, you need to have your eye on infrastructure at the same time. The infrastructure, I promise you, is going to be much more complicated than just buying the vehicles. You've got great partners out there that are going to provide those vehicles and are going to help you pilot through that. But if you wait too long to start understanding what those pilot results are going to mean in terms of electrification of your fleet, you're really going to struggle with that. One tip is that temporary power is your friend. Temporary power, if it hasn't gotten on your horizon yet as part of this pilot phase, please put it there. It's so important, not only when you're in pilot, but even as you start to go live. As you'll hear a little bit later on, the unpredictability of the work with the utility space and exactly when that power is going to come online. If you're not equipped to rely on temporary power through that, you would really find yourself in a position that starts to disrupt your operations, which is, what none of us want, with the negative impact that could happen on your customer. So I guess my tips here, always assume that you've under assumed the complications around infrastructure and the level of expertise that is going to be required there. Very few organizations are going to have that type of skill set organically or internally. So I encourage you to start thinking about your partnerships very early. What do you want to build out internally versus where you really want to rely on trusted partners to help bring you along the way. The pilots are going to be fun. You're going to learn a lot. And then I would also just encourage you to leave flexibility in your strategic plan. You are going to learn during these pilots. Not everything will go the way that you think it's going to go, from the routes that are appropriate for electrification to the timelines and the horizons for the infrastructure build.
Thank you, Marie. You hit on a lot of good points, from the vehicles to the infrastructure, the power, be it temporary or permanent. Many of the folks that I speak to are starting with a very small task force, or even assigning electrification to a one person desk. You mentioned that won't solve all of the problems. Can you speak a bit more about the extent of the effort that it takes to,
Yeah.
let's say, at least move through a pilot?
Yeah, sure. Just one example. So, Cisco's first scale pilot, just as an example, required the integration of 14 different external partners. So, the thought that any one person would be able to manage across that breadth, we very quickly realized that that was not going to be true. And it is about scarcity of talent out there too. So these individuals with these skill sets, like some of the people on the call with me today, they're in high demand. And just assuming that you're going to be able to go out and hire at the spur of the moment these very particular skill sets, it's probably not going to be true. So Virginia, my point is, those partnerships and in all of the work that I've done in my career, electrification required a partnership approach unlike any that I had ever experienced before.
Thank you, Marie. Couldn't agree more. All right, on to the next slide, please. So Jeff, moving past a pilot, can you please speak to the considerations and effort needed to plan for a larger yard electrification project, be that on or off premise for a fleet?
Yep, for sure. I think everything, really needs to start from an operational perspective. So looking at, how your fleet operates, when are your vehicles available to charge? Are you looking at midday charging, overnight charging? Might you need en route charging depending on where they're going and how far they're going? How many miles are they typically running? What's like the daily average mileage, but then also what is the worst case? Because you need to be able to plan for both, business as usual, and then what happens when you need to pivot or when something goes wrong. And then it's also very important to understand, what do you need for resilience? What's your strategy there? Are you going to provide maybe on-site generation in the early days of your fleet transition when you only have a few electric vehicles? Can you provide that resilience maybe from your existing fleet and retaining some of the diesel or natural gas vehicles, so that you can use those if you don't have charging one night? Kind of figuring out how you're planning on operating the fleet is really the most important step, because that really tells you what your worst case or maximum charging rate that you need per vehicle is, and then what your average or ideal charging rate is. And in a lot of cases, you'll find that that can be very different. And understanding how you're going to operate under both of those scenarios is very important when you start to talk to the utility, because there can be significant differences in how much power you might need and the utility lead time or their availability to serve, for example. So, if you think about some sites, you might only need to charge the vehicles on average at maybe 50 kilowatts per vehicle if they're going to sit there overnight. But if for some reason one vehicle doesn't charge, or if you need to run it out for a second shift, you might also want the ability to charge it at 200 or 300 kilowatts so that you can very rapidly top it up if needed, to deal with those edge cases. And I think, in our experience, major electrical equipment and chargers can take easily 12 months from the moment you order until it'll arrive on site. And so, you have to put some thinking in before you can even order it and figure out what kind of equipment you need. And then utility interconnections, we find, can take 12 to 24 months, or in many cases, 3 years, 5 years, and sometimes cost many millions of dollars. And so even if you're starting with a pilot project, it's important to understand what your final condition might be so that you can maybe start the utility moving forward, start early equipment procurement. That's something we're always doing. As soon as we're starting a project, we're buying switchboards and transformers and things like that so that we can get them on site as quickly as possible. And then also, while you're doing that pilot project, you can roll in some of the lessons learned that Marie was talking about that can really help you refine some of those early assumptions about how much energy your vehicles are going to need. So for example, we've been looking at one fleet for a bus operator. And if we looked at their kind of worst case approach, they need about 4 megawatts to charge the buses. But if we look at maybe hopefully a more optimistic, or something that maybe aligns better with their exact operations right now, we think we can charge the buses probably for 1.5 megawatts. But there's a lot of unknown between kind of that optimal and that worst case. And so what we're doing right now is planning the system for a 4 megawatt peak load, putting in electrical equipment, or at least planning for electrical equipment that can accommodate that, while very closely watching the operational data from the fleet as it electrifies over time, moving through 10 vehicles, a dozen vehicles, up to 100 vehicles, so that we can adjust that endpoint to meet with the actual operations, while still, as we're installing stuff today, making sure that it would work with that worst case scenario. In this project, it's very important because the utility can serve 1.5 megawatts. They can't necessarily serve 4 megawatts, in which case we need to look at additional on-site generators and things like that, potentially relocating the facility. So gathering that early data and applying it to your design can be very important.
Thanks, Jeff. Wow, using data-driven approaches, pairing charging requirements to the requirements of the fleet, of the route, sounds like it can get quite complicated, particularly for fleets that have multiple types of vehicles running multiple types of routes. If we move on to the next slide, that's something I'd like to dig into a bit more, is a mistake that I've seen quite early in days of transition is assuming that one size fits all. Large fleets with multiple types of routes and operations really shouldn't assume that a single charging strategy is one size fits all. Marie, can you please speak a bit towards utilizing multiple strategies to best pair routes to their needed charging? And while you're doing that, maybe mention how important it is to use the full 24-hour clock, pushing multiple charges, maybe through a single asset.
Yeah, that's right, Virginia. I think it does require the operators to step way back and really think about how they utilize their resources. And in many instances, you're not gonna electrify your entire fleet. You're gonna electrify, at least in the beginning, a portion of your fleet where those routes do meet the requirements of the vehicles and the infrastructure. So thinking about how am I going to now integrate that into my existing routing system and network. So there are different considerations, and thinking early on about how that's actually going to look for the operators in the field. So there are now these new factors they're going to have to consider, which vehicles can be paired specifically to which routes, and what charging infrastructure is going to be required at what thresholds to make sure that those vehicles are ready to go. I remember waking up one night with a nightmare about this when I was doing a fleet electrification, because frankly, we hadn't considered all of those things, and we weren't yet ready with the integration into our routing system to give those people on the ground that are making those routing decisions in real time as they go throughout their day, to give them the tools that they needed to do that, to make sure that they could still successfully service their customer. So it is there's more integration than you think, right? Every system that you use is somehow going to be touched by this, whether it's something like your maintenance system that you use, your maintenance system of record, or it's your routing system, or it's even your delivery mechanism by which your customers monitor, those vehicles as they're in progress toward the delivery. So I think it is about, it isn't one size fits all. Be really eyes wide open about all of the systems and interfaces that come into play between the time an order is received and an order is delivered at your customer's location, and being mindful that in all likelihood, you're going to have a mixed fleet. You're going to have your ICE engines out there. You're going to have your EVs out there. And at some point, you may even have different alternative fuels that you're using as well. So understanding the inherent complexity that will now come with that.
Thank you. Moving on to the next slide, let's say, believe it or not, keeping a site well maintained starts before the site even goes live. Jeff, in your last comments, you were mentioning that it's best to coordinate early with the utility partners. Can you speak to how you think about engaging early and what that engagement actually looks like?
Yeah, sure. At Volterra, before we ever buy a site, as soon as we find something that we might be interested in, our very first call is to the utilities to start understanding from them, what the pathway to power is, how much power we can get at the site, when we might be able to get it, and how long it will take, and what it will cost. And one of the things that we try to do with them is communicate flexibly. Utilities are used to getting a request where somebody says, I need this, right? I need 5 megawatts or 2 megawatts. And the utility goes and figures out how they can provide that. A lot of the time with managed charging, we can get by with between 3 and 5 megawatts. And what we want to do is talk to the utilities and understand, is there a break point in there? Like, if we get 3.5 megawatts, is that going to cost us $1 million? And 4 megawatts will cost us $5 million. And then we can figure out on our end with that difference how we can make it work with 3.5 megawatts. That's not a conversation that the utilities are very comfortable with, and they're not used to having it. So trying to have that early with them and let them understand the flexibility within our designs, I think is very important for managing those schedules and managing those costs. Sometimes we'll have we can get a couple of megawatts for a year or two, and then they can get the rest of the site later on. So that might then inform how we would phase development within our site or within your fleet. And so having that more kind of detailed discussion with the utility as opposed to just pitching something over the fence in the traditional manner is very critical. The way we do that is we have weekly or biweekly coordination meetings with all of the utilities and all the territories where we're operating. So we already have key contacts there. We're talking to them all the time about, potential projects, kind of early phase planning projects that are in, active construction where the utility is doing their design and bringing power to the site. Because all along that entire project life cycle, there can be changes in the utility end, there can be missed dates, there can be all sorts of challenges. And we need to have that very quick dialogue to get that information from them as soon as possible. And it's worth noting a lot of the utilities have EV specific groups that can help with the kind of interconnections for EVs. They think about their planning in a little bit more EV centric way, which is very helpful. And then some of them even have some online tools of varying use that will help us look for capacity on their system and figure out where we can best site our projects. But still, all of those things roll back to clear and almost constant communication with the utilities. And then, I can't underscore this enough, and Marie touched on it as well, is, always building in a contingency plan, in particular for commissioning. If the utility, they're always almost the last one for our projects. And so if they come in even a couple of weeks late, that can impact kind of our final site turnover and everything. So we want to make sure that we have an approach to get our sites up and running as quickly as possible with or without utility power. And Cleo can touch on that a little bit more in a couple of slides.
Sure. Speaking of Kaleo, I am going to move over to you now. Well, thank you, Jeff. It sounds like even just in coordinating with the utility that there are quite a few players there, be it an EV team, the metering department, the transmission team, and that's just the beginning of the story. So Kaleo, working with you, you've really taught me that commercial grade maintenance and support goes far beyond a manufacturer's warranty. It sounds like even more players will be coming into play. Reading through some scopes of work I've seen you write, I see that you tend to incorporate lots of players across the board. Can you speak a bit towards how important and far-reaching maintenance and support is, both on the charging and the site and at the site level?
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing to start with actually is with those utility partners. What we find in some in some districts, in some markets, the utilities may even own transformers that are coming in and being set on the site, versus other utility districts where the end user owns it, or the person operating the site owns it. And so even up front, understanding that and coordinating that with the utility themselves, to understand how how the operations and maintenance happens on a daily basis, on a quarterly basis, on an annual basis, is so important to reduce downtime. If a transformer fails, you need to have some contingency plans in place in order to be able to continue your operation. And if that contingency plan isn't there, and you haven't sort of discuss that with the utility themselves, if they own that transformer, you could be down for months. In some cases, these transformers do take that long to replace. And so, stepping forward through to the actual the site itself and the assets that have been installed, we engage with tons of different partners. To Virginia, to your point, those could be basic facilities partners. Those could be very specific O&M partners that focus solely on the chargers themselves. They could also be your general contractor who maybe has a workmanship warranty for a year. And so when you think about deploying these projects, there really are at least 3 to 5 sort of critical partners you have to think about and put in place and sort of work with to make sure that you're understanding and that you're operating against those partnerships. One thing I'll touch on here at the kind of the end of the tips is it really is beneficial to work with a provider that maybe has a strong track record of remote troubleshooting. And the remote troubleshooting is really what I want to talk about here. To Marie's point, kind of building out that expertise in-house, understanding how to look at charger fault logs as an example, and understanding what they actually mean it's like reading Matrix code. If everyone has seen that movie, The Matrix, where the code's running down that screen, it really is a different language. The language actually has a name. There's OCPI, and so when you're reading through these logs, if you're working with a partner or if you're working with someone in house that understands those logs and can read and understand what's happening, you can actually equip a service provider that's got to go out on site with tools and equipment with the specific item that's broken or the specific thing that needs to be fixed. There's also the remote troubleshooting could end up with remote sort of diagnostics and repair. So you can, in a lot of cases, if you pick the hardware correctly and if you've set up your infrastructure correctly, you'll be able to reboot a charger, as an example, with a power cycle remotely and get it back up and running without even sending anyone out. So, sort of working with partners like that is going to be really critical to sort of reducing your downtime, increasing your operational efficiency, and making sure those chargers are always available for your fleet. One other thing I'd love to call out here is also working with the local first responders. One of the items that we see a lot is specifically fire departments asking how they would respond to a fire event at one of these facilities. They know very well how to respond to diesel and gas fires, as an example. What they don't really know how to do yet is how to respond to lithium-ion battery fires inside of the vehicles. While the infrastructure itself isn't as critical as the vehicle fire, in terms of where the flame is really at. One thing first responders really want to know is, how do you shut down power? And so, working with your first responders to understand how to get them to respond to a fire like that is going to be critical to saving your infrastructure. As an example, we've worked with some local departments where they've said, we will not step foot onto that property until you tell us how you shut down the power. And so what that creates is a need for a pathway for these first responders to manage site operations and safety protocols when they show up. And so lots of thought and partnership going into a lot of these sites.
Thank you so much for that, Kaleo. Just a quick tip to the folks on the line. If you have a question or a comment in the meantime, please go ahead and put it into the chat or the question box. And since I'm the moderator, I'm going to go ahead and preemptively ask a question. So Kaleo, when you were talking about diagnostics, it's my understanding that not all diagnostics or troubleshooting or corrective action takes place after, let's say, a failed event. Can you speak a bit to the importance of proactive diagnostics and evaluating charging before any of the users even know that something's gone wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, so the proactive monitoring can be done in a number of different ways. You can either have, you work with a partner that either has 24/7 sort of network operation centers. You could onboard software that sort of has critical faults that get sent to you through email and those kind of things. The idea there is that some of these chargers may, they're very sensitive. They have a lot of sensors. They have a lot of different diagnostic tools that are available. And what can happen is, if, let's say, there's a critical fault because a wire, sort of got disconnected or overheated inside the charger itself, it would actually create a fault code that you can read, and the end user, your drivers, may not even have been needing to use that charger for the next 5 to 10 hours, depending on your operation. If you have that remote diagnostic tool set up and ready to go before anyone even tries to use that charger, a partner or your in-house person who's able to do this would be able to preemptively look at that charger. You can shut it down. You can sort of sometimes on these chargers there might be a code on the screen that says not available, please go to the next one. You can schedule all of your truck rolls with your service providers, again, prior to anyone even knowing there's anything wrong. And again, that really does sort of speak to that increased uptime and operational efficiency that we provide at Volterra. That is something that we see as a huge need for these fleet operators, because when it comes to where the rubber meets the road, your truck driver or your fleet driver really needs to just be able to plug in the charger and have it work, or be able to know that the charger is not working and to go to the next one. And so, yeah, I think the remote diagnostics and the proactive monitoring is something that kind of differentiates some of these operations from others. What you might see in a lot of public, kind of charging networks, as an example, is you might show up at a public charger, the charger's not working. There's nothing that tells you that. You just kind of have to figure that out. And then there may be an 800 number to call, and they may answer. They may say something like, "Yep, we know of the problem, and we're sending a technician." And in the fleet space, that really doesn't work. In the fleet space, we need that charger to be working at least 98% of the time. That's what we're always shooting for.
That's exactly right, Kaleo, and I've experienced that a time or two, and it's fascinating how, even for a EV charging professional like myself, how tricky working through some of those solutions can be. So definitely operating in the background and allowing your professionals, your providers like Volterra to take care of that for you is definitely a best case. Let's go ahead and move on to the next slide, mistake number 4, where we're going to be talking about not considering site conditions for scalability. So Jeff, when you were speaking with transitioning fleets, I hear you always asking about their plans for scale. I assume you're trying to ask enough questions so that we measure twice, cut once, or dig once, as it were. Can you speak a bit about planning for scale so an organization doesn't see runaway or wasted costs when it comes to the infrastructure side?
Yeah, it's a great point, Virginia. We find that most fleets don't do the whole thing in one go. They scale over time, as Marie mentioned and as you mentioned. Um, but when we're looking at infrastructure, what we want to do is look at the most likely end case, and as I mentioned earlier, maybe a more optimistic version and a worst case version, so we can kind of bookend the solution. And we want to do that because we want to understand how we're going to phase the infrastructure, how it will best align with the fleet growth in terms of when we think new vehicles will come online, how many will come online, so that we can put an infrastructure that best aligns with that. So for example, when we're looking at big sites, 5 megawatts plus that we're going to usually serve at medium voltage, even if we're only going to do a very small early phase, we might go ahead and install that medium voltage equipment, get the utility meter in, get the new feed in from the utility, or at least get prepared for that new feed from the utility, so that we kind of take that out of the critical path for future phases. And maybe we'll then put that medium voltage infrastructure in and feed, one transformer and a smaller switchboard. We'll provide that switchboard with room to grow for maybe, the second phase, but then figure out how equipment for phases 3, 4, and 5, where that's going to go, how that will be interconnected. If parts of it are getting routed underground, certainly we want to look at, where we're going to be paving the site, so we can run conduit in places where we're not going to have to cut and patch later. There's nothing worse than putting in new concrete for Class 8 trucks or something like that, and then 18 months later needing to come and trench through that to put in new conduits again. So really trying to look at like how those building blocks will come together. We always like to think of these things as Lego blocks, and you're gonna to get a whole site, you might put together 5 or 6 different blocks, trying to figure out what the right size for those is, what the lead times for all of those is, and in particular, how you're going to phase construction on site from an operations perspective. If you're doing this in an existing depot where there's existing operations, usually there's not enough space already for the operations. And now we're going to go in and put in electrical equipment that can be, fairly large, 20 by 30 feet for, clearances and everything like that with transformers. So where are those going to go? Where are the holding and staging areas for the construction going to be? What times of day can the construction even be done? Like simple things like that need to be considered. And then as you get into future phases, how are you going to connect the new chargers with the existing? Obviously, we can't take down all the existing chargers for a month while we do construction to add on new chargers, right? So what is the strategy? What is the approach? How does that align with the Lego blocks so that you're not buying more blocks than you need or bigger blocks than you need, to really try and do the whole thing most cost effectively, right? Not necessarily looking at phase one and saying, how do I do phase one as cheap as possible? Because that in the end might end up with a project that just doesn't work when you get to the whole facility, right? So it's looking at the end, walking it back with your phasing, and then trying to figure out what makes sense for each natural step along the way with that end goal in mind. And then in some
Thanks.
cases, like I mentioned earlier, you might find you don't have the capacity to do that on site. You can't do that on site. You need to put it in multiple locations or use offsite solutions as well.
Absolutely, Jeff. So I heard a lot from you talking about the vehicles, the infrastructure, the electrical capacity, construction, and that's not even to mention, some business requirements, some cost evaluations, the operations at a site, the operations for a business. But Marie's been through this. So Marie, could you provide an example or talk a bit about maybe a project that didn't do this well or one that did?
Yeah, I think what comes to mind first and foremost for me when we talk about this topic is making sure that your strategy is flexible. You're going to learn so much in the early years of this work. And having laid that groundwork with your internal management team and the people that approve these projects for you internally, that we don't know all the answers yet. And we are going to have to learn as we go. And Virginia, what I've seen too is even for a single entity or a single company or customer, it will not be a one size fits all solution. I mean, you just heard Jeff talk about, is there even room on your site to do this build, and how disruptive is it going to be to do this build? And I think it's okay that maybe some of your solutions involve a partner off-prem, or some of your solutions involve a shared off-prem solution, which can really help you manage those costs in the early days so that you're not bearing all of that infrastructure cost yourself. And I'll tell you personally, it was really painful when I had to go back and tell, my boss and my CFO what the cost of this infrastructure build was going to be and how long it was going to take. It was kind of like they were willing to pay for the vehicles, like I said before. That's the fun part. But then when you come back and say, oh, but I need $15 million because I got to build a 4 meg infrastructure and I've got to have battery storage for backup because of the situation that I'm in, they're not interested in that. So I think just really being open to different solutions in different phases and even the ultimate outcome. You may have a set of sites, for instance, where the route distances are perfect for an EV solution and the customers are asking for EV solutions, but that site itself either will not have the electrification necessary or they just flat out don't have the space. One funny story, we had just gone live at a certain site, beautiful build, everything was there. We had solar, we had battery backup and power storage. We had everything. And guess what happened on day 3? A yard driver ran into a charging station. I mean, it's also those kinds of things that will happen. Truck drivers will hit things, right? And so it gets back to making sure that you've thought about those scenarios and that it really does come into play. But then if you decide to think about off-prem, it's different because now you got to have somebody drive that truck somewhere to plug it in, right? And so again, it gets back to that routing complexity and the different solutions and the creativity that you will have to bring. And just understanding at different phases in your own maturity, different solutions are going to be applicable.
Thank you. All right, let's move on to one of our last slides. Kaleo, I'm going to ask you to close us out here. Can you please offer a tip to help back, please. Thank you. Can you please offer a tip to help folks make sure they're choosing the right charging assets for their needs? Are power levels important, or for example, will just about anything work?
Yeah, thank you. And yes, power levels are pretty important. I mean, obviously, we'll have to Jeff's points earlier. You could over design a site, you could under design a site. I think the power levels are something that will obviously sort of inform how many chargers you have, but it also could help inform what kind of operational load management you might have, as an example. And so, to Jeff's point, maybe we don't need the full 4 megawatts. Maybe you really only need 2 or 3. If you can load manage that over your operation, that's really a big portion of how you think about, or how you want to think about scalability. Excuse me. I think one of the tips here is when you're choosing the hardware, you really want to consider sort of everything about it. So there's the durability, the reliability, obviously, long-term support options. What you might have seen in some of the news reels is you might see some of these charging hardware manufacturers kind of going under, as an example. And so what we do here at Volterra is we're really vetting through all of those hardware manufacturers, looking at their manufacturing plants. Even we visit them constantly. We're talking to them about end-of-line support and how sort of what we're doing matches the scale of what they're doing. But we always want to make sure also that these chargers that we're installing have those remote capabilities we talked about earlier. They consider service agreements that guarantee high uptimes, as an example. And so what you're thinking about is almost like any kind of manufacturer, auto or any really manufacturer that has that needs to be serviced, or service is part of sort of the long-term cost of ownership. You want to think about these types of companies that have manufacturing plants, that have parts available, that have sort of all the different things that you want to think about in terms of keeping these assets healthy and constantly sort of up and running. You also want to ensure that the charging infrastructure itself is sort of compatible with the vehicles you're purchasing. What we do here at Volterra too is we do a lot of interoperability testing. And so what we might hear is from a customer is that we may be purchasing a specific OEM, and there may be a manufacturer too that just has not a great track record interoperating with that manufacturer, or if they don't have a real track record, we really want to make sure that we're testing sort of that charger and that interoperability with that vehicle. And so you really want to reduce those operational disruptions. And so, I think to say it, as succinctly as possible, that hardware decision making is not something that is really easy to do based on marketing brochures, as an example. You really got to have sort of someone who understands, again, that sort of manufacturing strategy, the types of language or beyond the OCPP, the interoperability that we were talking about, that they have that available, that they have sort of all of the different support available on the manufacturer side to be able to help service technicians keep your setup and running. And ultimately too, there's things to think about in terms of future of this product. We're all sort of hearing about 1 megawatt charging as an example. Thinking about maybe working with manufacturers that have a path to that is something that we do here at Volterra as well. So there's a couple of manufacturers we sort of always talk to when we're working through what we're going to install today and how to plan for tomorrow. And that doesn't include all the hardware manufacturers that are out there. And so, really want to think about it full picture here. It's how do you scale? How do you think about the O&M during the life of those assets? Then also, ultimately, how do you upgrade at the end of this all when the vehicles become available that have the 1 megawatt charging availability? And so, I think at the end of the day, in terms of the charging infrastructure and the operation, working with a partner like us or someone else in the space, or making sure you're building out your internal team to be able to do all these things is going to be one of the most important parts of this transition.
Thanks, Kaleo. And thank you so much to my panelists. The next few slides, we wrap up these mistakes and these tips in a digestible way, but we'll send out these slides, at the end of the presentation. I think since we have about 15 minutes left, let's go ahead and jump into the Q&A. So there were quite a few questions that were submitted ahead of time. Feel free to go ahead and drop any additional questions into the chat. But since Kaleo finished off this conversation with some comments on the megawatt charging standard, let's just keep going with that one. So Jeff, over to you. Could you speak for a minute to fill in with Kaleo's earlier points on what we're seeing in the market for MCS, the megawatt charging standard? Who are the main players? What does incorporating MCS into either a depot or a fleet look like? What do we need to think about as we're planning for that to hit the market more full force?
Yeah, great question, Virginia. So right now, I'd say it's a bit of a chicken and an egg scenario. We're just starting to get the chargers, but we don't, so much have the vehicles right now. And so what we are mostly doing is looking at how we, get sites ready to be converted in the future. And as Kaleo mentioned, a lot of that is starting to look through for chargers who have, or charger manufacturers who have approaches for this. One of the things I think that we're going to see is that the charging profiles for somebody using MCS might be quite different from somebody who's charging at like 200 kilowatts or less. And so what we're thinking largely is that we'll be able to share that capacity from the utility between maybe the MCS chargers midday, where you're more likely to get somebody coming in looking for a very fast top up, and then the slower chargers for more off-hour periods when somebody might leave the vehicle there. And so looking at chargers that can, with the same power conversion system, feed both an MCS dispenser or a 200 kilowatt dispenser or a bunch of 200 kilowatt dispensers is kind of a solution that we think is going to be a pretty good way forward. Right now, I would say, both on what we're seeing from the vehicles and our customers as well, is that everybody's like wanting to know how we're going to get there, but nobody's quite ready to deploy anything yet. And so we're still a little bit away from that. But with utilities, where sometimes like getting 2 or 3 megawatts can be a challenge. If you wanted to put in, half dozen or a dozen MCS chargers, you're very quickly looking at, 10 or 20 megawatts of capacity you need from the utility. And we're seeing like 6-7 year lead times for sites like that, right? So Figuring out how you might get something short term, as we talked about with the 200 kW chargers that converts to MCS in 5 years, is probably going to align pretty well with timelines.
Wow. So even just on the electrical side, we have level 2 AC, we've got level 3 DC across very many power levels, and now we have MCS. So that's 3 different categories just within electric. Marie, how do you think about incorporating multiple fueling types? So not just the 3 types of electrical that I mentioned, but when your fleet is still running diesel, when they might be transitioning to a cleaner diesel or to a CNG. What are some challenges that you see for fleets that are operating multiple different fueling types?
Yeah, Virginia, what I think we will continue to see is fleets will place their bets in a couple of lanes. The thought that you could actually manage, I don't know, hydrogen and electric and your diesel, and have the capability to do that on one site, it's just not going to be practical, frankly. So I think you'll see people kind of hedge their bets with a couple of lanes to try to keep it manageable. And it gets back to this partnership question, right? And the level of expertise and the level of training for any of us that have tried to hire qualified diesel mechanics. We know how hard that is to do, and to keep them, happy and gainfully employed with you for a long time. And you start to multiply that over even more select skill sets, it will become, even more difficult for operators to manage. So I do think you'll see they'll pick, right? It'll either be I'm going to experiment with hydrogen as I convert for longer routes, and I'm going to stick with diesel or clean diesel, for my shorter routes, or I'm going to do electric for some of my shorter routes and rely, just because of the practicality and being able to manage that and the regulatory side that will come with all those different channels.
Wow, that's a lot. And I think that there may be even more to it. So we've just had another question drop into the chat that I'd like to kick over to Jeff from a design perspective and Kaleo for operations. This is about backup power or temporary power. So for mission critical EV, and that can be in any, type of fleet that we're working with, either during a utility outage or in a instance where all the power we need to the site can't be brought. How do we best think about additional power sources, solar, BESS, or variety of generators? So Jeff, first with you from a design perspective, and then Kaleo, what are the challenges for operating all of these different fueling and generation sources?
Yeah, it's a great question. So usually I start thinking about what we call the energy trilemma, which is energy cost, energy sustainability, and energy resilience, and how those kind of come together for you. I think when you're looking at backup power options, a lot of it is looking at the number of hours per year that you're actually going to operate, as well as when you're going to charge vehicles in the business as usual scenario. Right now, batteries are very expensive. They're significantly more expensive than generators, and they come with, a very limited runtime. And you can either charge them by solar, or typically, or grid power. There's a few other options, but those are the kind of the main two. And unless you're going to be doing a lot of charging during like peak demand hours from the utility, they typically don't have a payback. And although it sounds, kind of bad to be charging vehicles from diesel generators or natural gas generators, what you actually find is that the total number of hours out of the year with utility outages that you're likely to have to charge the vehicles is, a day, maybe 2 days at the worst. And so running your entire charging infrastructure off of a fossil fuel source actually has kind of a pretty small uptick in emissions compared to everything you've reduced already by going electric. There's some combination where you can bring those resources together, but for the most part, I would say traditional diesel or natural gas generators is going to be the most cost effective. It'll also give you the longest runtime. So if something truly is mission critical, that's probably the best way to go. But you can look at adding in solars and battery, and certainly, I've done it on some projects. It just usually makes it a lot more expensive. But if sustainability and minimizing carbon is like really your gold star, that is probably the best way to go about it.
Yeah, maybe I'll jump in on the operations side. So something that Jeff and I were talking about earlier today actually was on the commissioning piece, as you're getting ready to open up one of these sites as an example, and this one is specifically thinking through electrified chargers, is that idea of having maybe a battery system that will help you sort of commission these chargers early, and help you sort of meet or get ahead of the utility being sort of having at their timeline of energization. And so, this idea of maybe mixed fuels, it kind of starts from even just thinking about creating the project in the first place, then all the way through the operations side. We have some folks that we've interacted with, and places, locations that I've built and maintained that actually have mixed fuels right on site. And so what you'll see is a couple chargers, you'll see a diesel tank or two, and some dispensers. We haven't typically seen a hydrogen plant on any of these yet. That is a very, very new type of solution in terms of it being at scale. We're seeing that as off-prem specifically right now. There are a couple bus facilities that we've seen that do hydrogen fueling as well. It takes up some space. You have quite a bit of room needed, and so when you think about sort of that trilemma, or having multiple fuels, and sort of hitting all your different goals, the space constraints start to become a real thing. And then to Marie's point, technicians, being in-house to fix all of this is also going to be pretty tough to do. And so thinking about that as a partnership, thinking about what's kind of my main fleet. Is it the diesel? Is it the clean diesel? Is it hydrogen? As we're scaling, is the smaller part of the fleet the electrical? From there, you can sort of make your decision around how you want your infrastructure to look. If it's going to be on-prem, off-prem, a mix of the few. I know we had another question about where these charging locations could be located. That's a big part of it as well. To Jeff's point, some of these locations that we're looking at, while it might be operationally efficient in terms of the siting of it, maybe the utility can't bring power in for 2 or 3 years. And so at that point, we're also talking about, do we bring in generators, be them diesel or battery electric storage systems with solar power on them. We've also worked quite a bit with CNG generation. So all the temporary power solutions are there. It just all depends on how you want to think about how quickly you want to scale into the electric side. And then operationally, again, on the maintenance perspective, it would be pretty tough to say that in-house you'd be able to sort of maintain all of those types of different fuels. Working with partners closely could be your solution there.
Yes, it definitely sounds that way. Speaking of partners, we have quite a few questions here about grants, incentives, or programs. And rather than going into what may be available currently for trucks, what may be available currently for the infrastructure, I think I'll just mention that it's very important to work with a partner like Volterra to make sure that your project is able to access as many of the applicable programs or upcoming programs as possible. There are some that operate through the electric utility. There are some at the state level, some at the regional level, some at the national level. Each one comes with its own sets of gives and takes. And the folks at Volterra incorporate and evaluate every single available program while building a project for our customers, be that at an off-premise Volterra location or on-premise if we're building a depot, just for you. And thinking about the cost efficiencies that come from a grant or incentive program, chipping away at what we call either the total cost of ownership, or when working with Volterra, I like to say the total cost of access. There are very many elements that go into, thinking about the cost structure of charging. So Marie, just over to you quickly to finish this out. What are some of the business considerations that folks should evaluate when doing either an on-premise or an off-premise charging project? Are there best practices for types of infrastructure? Should some of the aspects that Jeff was mentioning, either incorporating battery or solar, be taken into consideration? Or what's your overall thought on the cost impact of a project?
Yeah, one of the things I'd like to share is that as our customers and as companies are working internally to get approval for these kinds of projects, this is a very different kind of undertaking. So if you kind of think about your traditional procurement team that sits within your company, it's all about low cost. Kind of a standard template RFP that they get, RFI, RFP, they go through the process, the low cost wins unless there's a really good reason that shouldn't be. These projects are very different from that. In these projects, it often depends upon the relationships that you're building and the trusted partners that you're going to want to have alongside you as you go on this journey. And the amount of internal advocacy that's required from the business owners inside the various entities. I just be strong. There are going to be business. These are decades long bodies of work, and people get bored, right? It's really fun when the trucks first come out and everybody's excited, but in year 4, when you're still dealing with infrastructure investments and perhaps talent investments, and you're in maybe a more negative business cycle, it is really hard. And we all understand that you can't just pause for a year. If you pause for a year in this kind of work, you get thrown way off course because of the infrastructure complexities and all of that. So I think it's that level of internal advocacy, Virginia, more so than anything else. And I do think having that trusted partner approach. You need people that you can depend upon and rely upon to bring you solutions and to help you with when's the next generation of the technology going to come on board and how do I think about that. And because it is such a rapidly evolving environment, I always liked shorter term agreements, right? I wasn't always comfortable with purchasing a vehicle. I'd rather lease it because I know there's going to be a better EV, a much better EV 5 years from now across all of the classes and categories. So those are a couple of the things that come to mind, but this work is not for the faint of heart. And you do have to be willing to be that strong internal advocate there, at every time that the topic comes up to remind people of the long journey that you're on.
I agree, Marie. It's hard work, but it's fun work, and we are not here for solving easy problems. Thank you, everybody, so much for your time and attention today. Like I was saying, all of the slides and materials will be provided to all of the attendees and folks that may not have been able to make the webinar afterwards. I guess that's just to say, signing off. Until next time, thanks, everybody.